My name is Robert Ortung, and I'm a research professor here at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. It's our great pleasure today to host this talk. And so I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Institute and immediately turn the floor over to Georgi Derlugian, who will introduce himself very quickly, and then our speaker. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm in Yerevan in Armenia itself, and it's an evening here. It is my pleasure, to introduce Juho Korhonen, who is a fellow sociologist, and he's going to speak about the article which he authored, with Elena Rodina, another of our colleagues. So Juho is a sociologist of social movements, I should say, and globalization, and he works at the Boğaziçi University currently, in Istanbul. He is on leave, on leave, in Washington D.C. And please, the floor is yours. So this, I cannot speak better, than you would, about your article, I hope.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you very much, Georgi. Allow me to share my slideshow. All right, I hope everyone can see well. Do let me know if you cannot see the slide or hear me very well. So thank you, everyone. My name is Juho Korhonen, and I am a historical and political sociologist and an assistant professor of sociology at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. And currently I'm a visiting fellow at the Elliott School for International Affairs. My special thanks go to the Institute for European and Russian and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University for organizing, and to Professor Georgi Derlugian for chairing this talk. The research I'm going to talk about today was conducted together with my colleague Elena Rodina, who is a media and communication studies scholar. And we also co-authored an article based on this research that is currently forthcoming in the journal Europe-Asia Studies. The article should be out sometime after this summer. While I could not have conducted this research without my colleague Elena, I want to point out that any and all possible mistakes in my presentation today are purely my mistakes. So I'm going to take us back a little bit to the so-called Armenian Velvet Revolution of 2018 and its immediate aftermath. I must first say, though, that with everything that has happened in Armenia, in the wider post-socialist sphere, and in the world since then, it does feel strange to look back at what now seem like relatively much more peaceful days, only just about 3 years ago. This, of course, raises legitimate questions about whether the work that I will present today about activist journalists and their role in the Velvet Revolution no longer bears anything else except theoretical relevance. I do believe, however, that it is important to consider and to talk about local developments in places like Armenia, because too often their importance gets swept aside and becomes forgotten in the face of large international and political and economic turmoil and power relations, both in real terms, as has happened, as well as in terms of academic research by the international community. With that said, allow me to take you back to 2018 and 19 to the Armenian Velvet Revolution, and specifically to the role of activist journalists in it. There is, of course, limited time, and I can only talk about some aspects of our work. So what I will be doing today, there's a fire truck. So what I will be doing today is to first present a very brief outline of the research, and then a selection of what I consider as some of the possibly interesting sociological insights from the project as a whole. So I will be focusing on my sociological perspective and expertise. Moving on to slide 2, I hope you can see it change. So the Armenian Velvet Revolution took place in the spring of 2018, And within a short stretch of 1 month, 1 week, and 1 day of a series of public protests, the prime minister and the longtime Armenian president, Serge Sargsyan, was forced to resign. And the figurehead of the protests, Nikol Pashinyan, was elected by the parliament in his stead. On the right side of the slide here, you can see one news piece representative of the coverage in the foreign press of the Velvet Revolution. So the revolution was described in the press as one that, quote, legitimately boiled up from the streets, free of influence from outside forces, such as the US, NATO, the EU, or Russia, unquote. It was seen as a grassroots movement that resulted in democratizing change. A key feature of the revolution that scholars emphasized was its networked and decentralized character, meaning that the protesters effectively used online social networks and mobile apps to coordinate and broadcast daily protest activities, reaching out to very broad audiences. As you can see on the bottom left side of the slide, one of our interviewees explained that the internet won against TV, with grandparents watching the revolution on laptops in villages. And another interviewee summarized that the revolution was a media revolution. Traditional media was avoided. After the successful revolution, the figurehead of the protests and current Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and his civil contract party remain in power following 2 elections that the OSCE has characterized as competitive and well managed. There are 3 factors that make the case interesting for me and my colleague. First, the important and successful role of online and social media and the consequent decentralized protest organization. 2, the success of mobilization in overthrowing the authoritarian regime and maintaining power afterwards. And third, a more theoretical and sociological consideration, which is the fact that the organizational structure that sociologists consider crucial for post-transition stability, that in fact, sociologists consider the very cornerstone of democratizing change based on mass mobilization. This cornerstone of democratizing change based on mass mobilization, quote, did not seem to exist in Armenia, unquote. Furthermore, then, besides a missing organizational structure, following the Arab Spring especially, most literature in the social sciences argues that while the kind of digital social media-based and decentralized mobilization that we saw in Armenia can help facilitate protests, it cannot replace the long-term organizational structure required to produce stable and lasting change. In other words, scholars have so far concluded that actors and protests who leverage online technologies for mobilization purposes play always a supplementary role only, and that mobilization and regime change based only on social media and the advantages that digital organization provides can facilitate regime change, but is not related to post-transitional stability. Finally, on top of that, what is traditionally seen to exacerbate this mentioned need for a long-term oppositional organization is that Armenia, like many post-socialist contexts, is commonly seen to have, quote, weak grassroots participation in organized civil society, a lack of trust and a lack of engagement, and a separation between the informal and formal parts of civil society, unquote. In other words, if we believe the mainstream academic literature, this kind of a regime change was not supposed to have happened in Armenia. So these were our general points of interest regarding the Velvet Revolution. Here I should make clear that neither of us is an Armenia specialist. but both of us have worked with related issues in other post-socialist contexts. So we came to the study of the Velvet Revolution and the journalist's role in it from the perspective of our overall interests, and due to the fact that in this particular case, our interests as a sociologist and as a media and communication studies scholar happen to intersect. So it looked like regime change was successful in Armenia, even without that long-term centralized organizational structure. And we were curious to find out if that was really the case, or if we would find an explanation, perhaps as an organizational structure that we had overlooked. And very soon we did find one possible explanation. But what we found was not a traditional protest and opposition organization, the kind that sociologists had theorized as necessary for stable regime change, the kind that is independent from social media-based organization and perhaps only benefits from it. Instead, we found a decentralized professional network that was embedded and integrated with digital and social media activism. We found activist journalists. So we had started to interview journalists about the nature of the protest and the usage of social and digital media. We conducted preliminary interviews in 2018 and a final round of 25 interviews in December 2019. These interviews were conducted in English or Russian, and they were all conducted with Yerevan-based journalists and media workers. It should be therefore kept in mind that this research offers only a particular window into the Velvet Revolution, not a wholesome encompassing picture. During our interviews, it soon became clear to us that our interviewees were discussing the events and their participation not as independent and objective journalists covering the events, but as active participants who used their skills for the benefit of the mobilization. We learned, for example, that many journalists had become politicians and government officials following the regime change and the 2018 elections. According to the self-announced information on the Armenian parliament's website, over 25%, that is over 1/4 of the MPs elected in the wake of the Velvet Revolution had a background in journalism, media, or public relations. As you can see on the right side of the slide, one interviewee, for example, pointed out that journalists are the most active part of the society, and that Pashinyan, the figurehead of the protests and a journalist himself, quote, needed people, and who can help but the journalists. It seemed obvious to our interviewees that journalists would be the ones to step up. Another interviewee said that now it is visible that many former journalists came to power. For instance, a former journalist guy is now working for Pashinyan, but he was with the microphone during the revolution. Indeed, while the current Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, was the figurehead of the revolution and a journalist himself, other analysts have also noted since that, quote, it is the case that many more journalists than Pashinyan played a role in building both the political coalition and the broader climate of revulsion to the corruption of the regime that resulted in the Velvet Revolution, unquote. At this point, we felt like we had found our missing organizational structure. However, as we did more interviews and dug deeper into the history and context and talked to more journalists, it became clear that this was not the traditional and institutionalized organizational structure of a social movement that sociologists talk about. For starters, it was not centralized. Rather, the leadership of Pashinyan sparked further decentralization of protest groups. It was not organizationally embedded in civil society. Rather, it depended on social and digital media for its mobilization. All right, then. What does it then entail to be an activist journalist? What is the difference to regular journalists? This is a debated issue, so I'm just going to scratch the surface here. One definition from the literature goes like this. Activist journalism is a phenomenon of journalists not following the ethical norms of neutrality and objectivity. choosing to actively support one side rather than remain watchdogs. It includes the use of journalistic skills within activist media to report on and inspire political engagement with one or more issues. What is more important to note, though, is that activist journalism has been largely regarded a problematic thing, leading to a crisis of public knowledge, to polarization and fragmentation of the public sphere, to information wars, and to the spread of disinformation. In the West, activist journalism has been perceived as a relatively new and problematic concept, but it has been a common, although not yet very well explored, phenomenon in states with either non-democratic or hybrid systems. In these states, where the freedom of speech and freedom of press are limited, journalists have consistently supported anti-state opposition and have sided with oppositional activists. Such are the cases, for example, of China, Turkey, former Soviet states, including Russia and Armenia. What is important, however, is that even after becoming full-time activists, these journalists still maintain their status as journalists, relying on the journalistic tools they learned, the utilization of their journalistic careers, and on their extensive contact networks and the trust of the audience, who still see them within the context of their journalistic past. Second, journalists who side with oppositional forces tend to have broader goals than just activists. While activists fight for a certain social or political cause, such as pollution, activist journalists, while supporting the cause, at the same time see their involvement in it in a context of fighting for free speech and free information. Then, in a state with authoritarian ruling practices, journalistic activism aims not only at a specific cause, but at a larger cause of fighting for these freedoms. Now, this makes their role broader than that of cause-specific activists and positions them at a similar level in terms of impact and agenda as professional politicians, which can also potentially ease their transition from journalists to activists to full-time politicians. In other words, in the context of post-socialist and authoritarian politics, activist journalism can look very different than in what we call more established democracies, with strongly institutionalized and separated fields of media, politics, and civil society. Then the entanglement between media and political activism is the result of a longer continuity in Armenia. It includes the understanding that by being a media actor, one is necessarily political in some regard, and thereby also politically responsible. Claims about non-political journalistic professionalism would in fact raise doubts. One of our interviewees stated that in Armenia, a journalist can make a political statement on Facebook, and go to a rally, put down a camera, and become a part of that rally. No one sees it as a problem. I once mentioned on a program that in the West, even for something like that, a journalist can be fired. It shocked people. To put it simply, in the post-socialist context where the relationship of media with politics is already historically considered by the audiences to be possibly suspect, neutrality is understood as a restraint on journalists and would rather undercut their credibility. In this context, people are keenly aware of the political dimensions of information and media. This mistrust of journalistic neutrality and the demand for clearly outlined explicit political affiliation of an individual journalist as an expression of honesty further increased in Armenia with the proliferation of social media networks, which made direct feedback and interaction between the journalists and the public possible and expected. The news need to prove its worth by directly interacting with the citizen media consumer and need to be transparent about its political standpoints. Claims to a neutral standpoint would be considered political, in fact. This role of the journalists has continued after the revolution. An interviewee said that the new government uses online channels, do regular lives on Facebook, talk to the people very often. Pashinyan's been telling his advisor that he doesn't need his own media because he can talk to the people directly. This is not due to the fact that he was himself a journalist, but because journalism was the place where the oppositional minds were concentrated. Another interviewee explained, Pashinyan tried not to use media in general. He said that everyone is media. Let's go live. These interview quotations reflect how no clear-cut transition is visible between activist journalists in power, in journalism, or in the opposition. Their authority was not just a phenomenon attributed to the revolutionary situation or purely to their access to media, but linked with the role of journalism in this post-socialist context. After having become politicians, activist journalists continued to communicate as journalists and relying heavily on social media to report on their own and the government's actions. According to one of the journalists we interviewed, quote, the members of the government are former journalists, activists, so they continue to behave in this manner. They post all their opinions, decisions, and one can always write to them, ask and comment, and they will answer. During the revolution, Nikol Pashinyan had millions of views. It was decentralized. It could be in the university, etc. Everyone became media, unquote. All right. We suggest then that in the post-socialist context, the role of the activist journalists, together with decentralized digital and social media, was able to supplant the traditional organizational structure that sociologists consider crucial for post-transitional stability and success. To the extent that this analysis is true, it has some possible consequences. First, while some have suggested that we live in an era of politicization and crisis of traditional media, this directly applies only to contexts where there has been a traditional and institutionalized autonomous media, and may not play out similarly everywhere. In the post-socialist context, for example, journalists can be less bound to historically established institutions, both in terms of defending their informational value, as well as in terms of suffering from their delegitimization. As such, activist journalists can be on a better footing than their counterparts elsewhere to harness what, for example, sociologist Rogers Brubaker has called populism's pro-democratic energies. This said, one must keep in mind that it does not mean that activist journalists would not harness populism's authoritarian energies, as we actually tend to see more commonly. In this light, our analysis problematizes the contention that, quote, digital media has enabled activists to skip required organizing efforts and launch massive waves of contention without building any organizational infrastructure or prior coordinating. All right. Moving then from these consequences to some of the conclusions. In other words, the Armenian example suggests that a sustained change in the media civil society landscape has not meant a skipping of required organizing efforts, but those efforts and requirements may have qualitatively changed themselves or been different. As forms of populism exemplified in our case by activist journalists may also harness these pro-democratic energies. Consequently, we offer a view that is alternative to explanations of the Armenian regime change as the result of an underdeveloped civil sphere or an underdeveloped political culture, or, quote, a simplistic worldview due to Soviet legacies and a lack of democratic tradition, unquote, as some analysts have suggested. Rather, in a situation of eroding media legitimacy, a fragmented public sphere, continued informational wars, and the politicization of media, the Velvet Revolution speaks to an active, networked, and resilient response from the Armenian civil society, one that is usually explained as the result of long-term institutionalized organization by protest movements. Finally, in terms of some further suggestions rather than actual conclusions, while previous research has shown that lively civic action and networks do in fact exist in Armenia and post-socialist contexts, it has often taken different forms than their counterparts historically in the West. As Iskanian argues, Armenian civic initiatives by default, quote, embrace a more political understanding of civil society, unquote. To some, while a Western-style civil society may appear weak in Armenia, civic activism and citizenship practices connected to a more politicized understanding of the public sphere and media are very much present. Our findings suggest that in the case of Armenia, regime change occurred in part due to the active political role of the local activist journalists, who by utilizing and mobilizing their social capital and skills, managed to not only help organize political change, but to maintain the stability of the new regime. This then shows that research on smaller, so to say, and less known places and countries can highlight important shortcomings of existing theories. Finally, with some hesitation, I would suggest that we should not reduce the entanglements of politics and media to that of information control or information wars, and that policy-wise, instead of only supporting a professionalized and politically independent media field, as was often the goal of Western donors and experts after the fall of the Soviet Union, the general capacity and plurality of local media actors matters also, if not more, for the possibilities of democratizing change. Thank you very much for listening. All right.
Thank you. Well, a round of applause.
Thank
you. I hope, my connection, so I am getting messages, that the connection is unstable. Just in case I disappear. This happens here once in a while. So please, so there are people, who would like to raise their hands. So if you're done, could you please unshare the screen, for the presentation to see the participants?
Right.
No.
Right.
And yeah, done. So I see, Narek Seferian, so who would like, would you be the first, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Verdugian. Good to see you. Thank you, Professor Korhonen, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm a PhD student at Virginia Tech's School of Public and International Affairs in the Washington, D.C. area. So excuse me that I do not have the expertise in sociology or media studies, but I certainly, I was there in Armenia in May 2018, and I've followed very closely the events, and you've given some very interesting food for thought, especially when it comes to conceptualizing what journalism means and what it means to be a journalist in Armenia. I wanted to highlight two factors, and I wonder if this featured in your studies or if they're worth pursuing. The first was the question of let me see, I had it in my notes here. Yes, the first is the media sphere. So the way you are comparing it with other social movements and other cases, the media sphere in Armenia, especially online, has been quiet free. I mean, we did not experience a media blackout, the internet being turned off in May 2018, or even before, or even after. And I wonder how that stacks up with Arab Spring or other cases like that. And the second factor I wanted to highlight was the question of time. You characterize the activist journalists as a professional network as opposed to an organization. But I did want to highlight that for at least 10 years, if not more, these episodes have taken place like one of the mysteries that you mentioned, Abraham and Shagwan wrote about, one of the mysteries in May 2018 was why it worked. Why did so many people come out on the streets? And I think one response to that is, well, they've been trying this over and over again for 10 years. And so I wonder how that temporal factor might have featured in your account of the building of this network. Thank you.
Shall I go ahead, Georgi?
Yes, please. So
thank you.
When you're done, I might have my own questions, so but please, the audience, this is getting quite interesting here. So my short question would be, where did they come from? Just as Narek said, but where did they all go? It looks like, now we are at a very low point. And I'm very sorry, speaking of the internet, listening to you, I'm getting messages from my colleague, a sociologist in Kiev. So they have internet, they have electricity as well. So quite interesting. Please proceed, Juho. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Georgi, and thank you, Narek. These are all three very good points that we also at least partially try to address in our work through the interviews and what the journalists themselves say about these points. Definitely, several of the interviewees said that Sargsyan chose the path of soft power authoritarianism, trying to create alternative media sources while allowing yet a relative freedom of opposition media to exist. And had another route been chosen, the situation could have been very different. So yes, this at least relative freedom of media was important. And that I think connects also to the timeline question that you posed, that there were in the past 10 years, at least before the Velvet Revolution, what I believe one interview called the rehearsals to this situation. And those definitely mattered. Perhaps only at this point then we reached a crucial threshold where the decentralization of protest was able to keep going as decentralized protest. But this is purely hypothetical on my part. And Georgi, you raised a very good point. Where did they go? I did not speak about this part in my presentation, but many of the interviewees raised 2 points. The first one being that the fact that so many activist journalists moved into the government was a huge blow to the Armenian civil society. And the second point is that as they moved into the government, at least for the time period right after the Velvet Revolution, it became difficult for the remaining journalists to kind of reorient themselves and think about how to critique these colleagues who are now in the government. So these were 2 points about where did they go that our interviewees themselves raised. I hope that somewhat answers very excellent questions.
Thank you very much. We have time for more questions. So please, mostly would like people to raise hand. Professor Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Georgi. Very nice to see you. Juho, fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. I'm just curious about the quality of the relationships of the network. Are these journalists who all know each other friends? Are they rivals? Are they now, especially that, as you mentioned, 1/4 of them or a substantial portion of them are now in government? Are they adversaries? And so, in a sense, what is the culture of the relationships that existed among the journalists that enabled them to create this really powerful and interesting transformative practice? Thank you.
At the time of our interviews, let me begin with how they described the situation during the Velvet Revolution. And it's a bit of a cliche, but most of our interviewees talked about it kind of like the weak ties. Like I know half of the people, or I'm acquainted with half of the people in the government now. I met that person here and there. Fewer of the interviewees were directly friends with any of the people in the parliament or in the government. But most of them pointed out how they know so many people there. This would be my characterization. Perhaps weak ties fits into that characterization or not, but a part of the wider professional network, so to say. At the time of our interviews, especially the 2019 ones, some of them were clearly becoming critical and trying to invent ways in which to be oppositional and critical, even though these were some of the same people and journalists that they were embedded in the same professional networks. Based on that trajectory, I would assume that now there are some slightly more clear divisive lines, but of course, I do not know the current situation exactly. So much else has also happened since. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. That was quick. Do we have more questions, dear colleagues? Around us. So we have a few more minutes to go. So let me ask this critical question. What one name I haven't heard yet was Lenin, in his classic work on party literature. That of course, this is a revolution. Don't even pretend, to be neutral. It's a bourgeois and counter-revolutionary pretense, and so forth. With which I wonder, not so much, how it applies to the current situation. I wonder if any of the people you interviewed at all knew about these debates from more than 100 years ago, from a totally different universe. Is it a different universe for them? Are they aware, that this kind of debates had existed, in different centuries?
That's a good question, and actually, one of our peer reviewers raised the same question. A few of the interviewees joked about Lenin or former revolutions, but it seemed like they didn't feel it appropriate to bring that up, at least in the interviews. This might be a problem of the fact that we are not Armenians or did not conduct the interviews in Armenian. Perhaps they did not want to go deeper into this or felt like it's not the right thing to talk about. That being said, we do offer only a particular window instead of a larger picture. And I feel like what you're pointing to would be more pertinent to a larger picture view of the revolution. Then again, this reminds me of the fairly recent work by Liliana Riga on the social networks of the Bolsheviks and the Russian revolutionaries. And from that kind of also narrow window of social networks, I see certain similarities in terms of perhaps the weak ties and then the way in which it was easy to mobilize this network. But now I feel like jumping way too much ahead in terms of pure hypothesis.
Thank you. So in what language did you conduct the interviews?
In English and Russian, depending on the preferences of the interviewer.
That should, well, they are all educated people, so that should be quite all right. Interesting. Thank you very much. Do we have questions here? Because if not, we are in exactly like good schoolhouse, 45 minutes into the talk. Exactly. And please, dear colleagues, do I have any more questions? I don't see anything. So Nareg wrote something. And sorry, for me it's difficult to read in this very small print on the right. But that's not a question. I think it's a comment. Correct?
Yes.
Yes, Michael, so you raised your hand, it seems.
Well, if there's, I don't want to lose this great assembly here without having some reflection on the conjuncture in which this Velvet Revolution takes place and the conjuncture of the world in which we're having this discussion. So, Juho, you did say, how complicated it is to think about that moment in this time. But I'd love to hear you go on a little bit, and Yorgi, for you to go on a little bit about how these different conjunctures might be thought of together rather than in separate spaces.
May I ask Yorgi if you would like to go first?
Not really. not my. As I usually joke, there is a rule of professional thieves that they don't thieve around their homes. But yes, I sometimes, I cannot help observing, what's going on, but, most of the time I'm not connected. Actually, I missed that revolution in 2018, by a couple of days. Mostly, it was a big surprise. And I'm still quite puzzled about it, whether it teaches us anything, so what happened, so it was being prepared by emergence of new generation of protesters, and Armenians are relatively fearless, they don't fear their own authorities. But then, of course, the loss of war, and now, what the situation is, frankly, very grim here. That there are only Russian troops standing between Azerbaijani and Armenian troops, so, and the Russians might, well, disappear, as you realize, right now. So I think, we are very short distance, from a real nationalism are very much out there. What is interesting, of course, that we observe, well, it's interesting, it's very predictable, the usual trajectory of a revolution, as Nikol Pashinyan and his group are becoming more and more authoritarian, and they are fortifying their position by using the authoritarian constitution, extremely authoritarian, actually, almost grotesquely authoritarian, which was created by their predecessors for themselves. So the irony is that Nikol Pashinyan is not only popular, he's in power because he cannot be removed without another revolution. And the revolution so far failed against him, so this could be an explanation, why there are no more revolutionaries. There are counter-revolutionaries, the help in surviving, for Nikol Pashinyan was provided by his opponents, who became so identifiably old regime people, and putting probably too much money into their effort, which reminded everyone of who they were and how did they earn their money. But what might be coming next, so well, all eyes on Russia and Ukraine now. I hope, the South Caucasus for the moment doesn't matter very much. So what would you say?
Thank you, Georgi. I don't have similar insight, but speaking purely from the perspective of this research that we conducted, I would reiterate how local developments get overrun so easily by larger power relations. In terms of some of the contacts that I maintained, the race and then the loss of hope already before the war seemed so dramatic and drastic. And finally, perhaps a cliche reference to democratization theory, in the sense that it is always a, how do you put it, a two-edged blade. Any openings for the better can also create openings for the worse. Mm-hmm. That's what I have.
All right, dear colleagues, if we have no more questions, so this might be, so anyone, the last urge, this could be the time to wrap up. Oh, Birgan, if I could see, so please be more proactive, because otherwise, we should be closing soon. Yes, please name yourself. Yeah.
Birgan, my name is Birgan. It's nice to see you, Juho, and thanks for organizing this. I just wanted to ask you actually a clarification question. I was wondering, I get that activist journalists were important in the moment of mobilization, right? But then can you tell us a bit more about the stages in between the moment of mobilization and the overthrow of the regime and the setting up of a new one? Was it all as decentralized as the protests or the mobilization online? What kind of processes went into this? Like in Chile, we know that a new constitution was collectively discussed. I was just wondering about the stages in between. And sorry if this is repetitive.
No, it's a great question. I want to be careful not to overstep what I can say, but the decentralization quite quickly disappeared, at least in the form in which it was maintained by the activist journalists during the protests. But what is perhaps in a simplified manner, perhaps the main point was that this network that lacked an organizational structure embedded in civil society was able to keep going past that moment of mobilization and stay in power. Whereas existing theories would predict that without that strong embeddedness in civil society, they would lose their power position, or something else chaotic would happen after the revolution itself in the post-transitional situation. But they seem to have kept going nevertheless.
Yeah. Is it
Thank
okay?
you.
Anyone else, going, we might go for another minute, but we are nearing the hour. If not, let me thank you, Juho, and our wonderful audience again. So thank you very much, Michael. Yes, round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Georgi.
Wish you health in your life. Marek. Good night.
Have a good evening. Stay in touch.